party in the election, after the election, then they wanted the President of the Commission to come from their party. And that's why we got Barroso, and because they're still the largest party is why we still have Barroso. So the reality is that there is already a link between how you vote in a European election and who actually becomes President of the European Commission. But it's a very obscure link. And the only way we will really deal with it is if the proposals of my colleague Andrew Duff on the Constitutional Affairs Committee are taken up, whereby we take a percentage of MEPs, maybe 5%, should be 35 MEPs, and we elect them on cross-border lists. So that at the European election, you actually have two ballot papers. You have one for your own constituency, and you have one for a list which might be headed by a German or an Italian or a Finn or whatever. But you're elected there. And then what the political parties would do is they would almost certainly put their candidate for presidency of the Commission at the top of their list. And I talk in my book, or I write in my book, about how we've started to develop pan-European political parties at the same time as we've been doing this. And one of the things I did in the Liberal group was I got us organised. I made sure that the commissioners who came from Liberal parties met together regularly. I made sure that when there was a council formation, let's say the transport ministers were meeting in Brussels, the Liberals among them would have a meeting the night before or a meeting over breakfast to discuss how they were going to approach the different dossiers. It's kind of breaking down the influence of the member states and putting in its place an ideological pan-European influence. The only other thing I would say, Claudio, and you raised lots and lots of things, is one of my enduring memories of the whole 15 years that I spent from 1994 to 1999 is how much time was taken up, everybody's time, in trying to get the right treaties, trying to get a set of treaties that allowed the European Union to work effectively, to react quickly if it was needed, to find a way of making sure that one member state couldn't block progress on something forever and a day. And, you know, we went through the Maastricht Treaty, which didn't quite work. There's lots of literature about the Maastricht Treaty you can read to find out why. The Amsterdam Treaty, which didn't work. The Nice Treaty, which was a disaster. Not the treaty itself, but the process of getting there. 3 days and 3 nights spent by heads of state and government in Nice. And then a constitutional treaty, which was supposed to have replaced 1,800 pages of overlapping treaties with 250-page document, and which would have worked, I believe, but because it was rejected in France and the Netherlands, was considered to be dead in the water, and eventually the Lisbon Treaty, which I think probably gives the Union the tools that it needs to do the job for 10 or 15 years to come. There are 1 or 2 national leaders talking about 1 or 2 small treaty changes, but I don't think they will get very far.
Thank you, Susan.
I'm really glad you mentioned Andrew Duff and about his proposed electoral reform of transnational party lists in Europe and elections. When I look at a piece of work such as your book, from my research perspective, what I'm interested in is what does this tell us about the linkages between parties and about individuals and those they're intended to represent. And for me, in my research background, that linkage, the main mechanism for that sort of responsiveness or representation is through elections. And I have to say that last week was in Brussels. It was an end-of-project meeting where we were discussing the results from our last European election study that we did on the 2009 election. And then I was reflecting upon, no, actually it's the culmination of 10 years of research. We're starting with the 1999 European election, going through the 2004, and then continuing on with the 2009 election. And since I view any sort of work through the lens of elections, I was very pleased to see that almost you had really broken down the book into a story about an election happened, and this is in terms of policy. This is what was able to happen. It's not, I mean, you break it down in the more important years, or where more has happened into further chapters, but it always starts with a story about an election, and even the discussion of leadership and how you got a liberal leader is in terms of the size of the win in the last election, and what sorts of, what that allows the party or the group to demand in terms of concessions. So there is this, even though the book really is about policy and what you're able to achieve in terms of ideas, it does start from a story about elections. Okay, that's the way I would tell it. That is a linkage then between institutions such as elections and policies or ideas. So my questions, and these are just asking you from your perspective to reflect upon them, and some of them you've already talked about, like electoral reform. But in terms of, as I said, the conference I was at last week was a culmination of a research project about European elections. We received a sizable bit of money to study elections. Colleagues who study other types of elections and other things always point out the fact that we get an awful lot of money to study elections that don't seem to matter a whole lot, and are not driven by European issues, but are driven actually by national conditions. So that's sort of one tension I think I would like you to talk about, is this, you know, there are some very important policies at the European level, but here we are, and you mentioned, you know, but voters still to this day decide, though there is some change with growing powers of parliament, still to this day